Hey, let me read to you this prayer. If you ever need some help with your prayer life in the morning, here's a good prayer to pray. Dear Lord, so far today, God, I've done all right. I haven't gossiped. I haven't lost my temper, haven't been greedy, grumpy, nasty, selfish, or overindulgent. I'm very thankful for that. But in a few minutes, God, I'm fixing to get up out of bed. And from then on, I'm going to need a lot more help. Please be with me. Some of you maybe could relate to this issue. Somebody reported, the bad news is I accidentally took the wrong medicine this morning. The good news is I'm now protected from heartworms and fleas for the next 3 months. And if you've ever had any experience with little kids, here's a 3-year-old daughter that's talking with her mama. Look, Mommy, I killed a fly. Well, at the time, she was eating a big pickle when she killed that fly. So Mama said, go wash your hands. And then the 3-year-old daughter comes back, and the mama says, how did you kill that fly all by yourself? Mama, I hit it with my pickle. Only children. I got myself a senior citizen GPS the other day. Not only does it tell me how to get to my destination, it also tells me why I wanted to go there. Hey, the other day I walked into a room and I remembered why I was supposed to be there. It was the bathroom, but I'm still proud of myself. Because you do have that issue, you know, as you age, about going into the room. Now, why was I here? Well, I want to tell you about Millie. Millie Hartman. No offense to any widowed person I've ever met, but I can't imagine anybody taking her place. I refer to her as my favorite widow. I met Millie at the Groesbeck Church of Christ on the north side of Cincinnati, and I was there preaching in a gospel meeting a few years ago. The preacher, Mark Phillips, was a good friend of mine, and he said early on in that gospel meeting, he said, hey, Dean, I've got this 90-plus-year-old lady who wants to take you out to lunch. Well, having had a wife for 41 years and 3 daughters, I learned not to say no to a female. And so I said, Mark, go ahead. I said, just set it up, and that'll be great. So Millie takes me to a Japanese restaurant, which I thought that was another strange thing. I didn't know 90-plus-year-old women ate at Japanese restaurants. But I guess she liked to live on the edge, so she took me to this Japanese restaurant, and the server came and we ordered our meals. When the server left, I did the same thing with her that I often do with widowed people when I'm with them, especially more personally and privately. I said, Millie, would you tell me your story of love and loss? As a matter of fact, someday I would like to write a book. After I get done with the 3rd one in this series that I'm writing now, I'd like to write a book that is filled with stories of love and loss. Because I think there's real value in hearing about other people's life stories. You know, your story matters. Whatever your story is, your story matters. And it's because of your story you have influence. You have unique influence because of your experiences and people knowing about your experiences. So she began to tell me her story about how that 65 years ago, she got married to this guy, and he was a wonderful man, and she told me a little bit about their marriage. And then she told me about how that he got diagnosed with cancer, and how that she had taken care of him, and then how that she was able to be with him when he passed on. And I just complimented her for her faithful caregiving. I told her how impressed I was with that number, 63 years. What an awesome blessing that was, and what a great example that they had to have been to others who knew about them and their marriage. And then she dropped this bomb. She said, but that wasn't my first husband. And that's the first time at that point that ever happened to me. And I said, Millie, tell me about your first husband. She said, well, I was 19 years old, and we had a 1.5-year-old child at that point, and I was pregnant. He was in General Patton's army in the Battle of the Bulge. And he died in the Battle of the Bulge. And she said, I had him buried in France. And I can quote exactly what she said after that. A decision that to this day I regret. Here she was, 19 years old, pregnant and with a 1.5-year-old child. In the mid-1940s, how in the world did that woman survive? I told her about, what an awesome story that she was. It was about 2 years after that loss that she was able to be remarried and had that 63-year-old marriage with that second man who embraced her children like they were his own. After I met her in Cincinnati, Ohio, there were times afterwards that I would do a widowhood workshop and I would call her and say, Millie, I want you to know I've told your story. I want you to know the value and the inspiration in your story. Other people are hearing about you and about your ability to survive and learn to cope and even grow and live a meaningful life after a horrific loss at a very difficult time in your life. I know that that was an encouragement to her because one time I called her and had to leave a message. And she didn't have my number. I had hers, but she didn't have my number. And she talked to the preacher and she said, Mark, I want the number of Dean Miller. And she even called me back after I left a message one time on the phone telling her about how I'd told her story. It was really helping her. It was really encouraging her. There is life after loss, but it can be extremely difficult. And hers certainly was at 19 years old in the mid-1940s. What are the risk factors about becoming widowed? Well, the first thing you got to do is get hitched. If you never get married, you're never going to have to be at risk in regard to widowhood. The second thing you've got to do is stay married. Not everybody stays married. But if you get married and you stay married and then you keep living, those are the risk factors. Whenever we get married, we share our I do's. And those I do's are in recognition of the fact that we're making this commitment. And we say at the end, there's this phrase, until death do us part. We concede, we recognize publicly the fact that there's going to be an end to what is starting that day. But how many times do we talk about that or think about that after that ceremony? Even in the Brotherhood, when we have our marriage seminars or our retreats for married people, do we ever talk about what one of the two of them is going to have to deal with if they get married, stay married, and keep living? Just like there's a need to help provide premarital counseling to help people transition from being single to being married. And I'm a huge fan of that. It does not totally, in every way, prepare a person for that transition from single to married. But I'll guarantee you, people who have good premarital counseling prior to that transition, that helps them. And it increases the chances of that transition being a little bit more smooth and a little bit more successful. Now, just like premarital counseling to help go from single to married, how about talking about and studying about and reflecting about and researching about widowhood to help people transition from being married to being widowed? Because somebody is going to be widowed. They're going to be left behind. That's a part of my motivation in providing these widowhood workshops so that people can understand a little bit more about this issue. Things commonly associated with widowhood. You remember me telling you about Denny? And Denny was back there just when we were starting this point. And Denny raised his hand. I'd had him as a teenager in Lisbon, Ohio, through his high school years at camp. And I knew Denny Hickerson very well. Here he was married, and I think he had 3 or 4 kids. And he raised his hand. The first thing he said was, old. That's what he associated with widowhood, old. I said, yes. That is commonly associated with widowhood, but that's not always the case. You can be widowed at any time after you say, I do. And it's amazing how many people less than 44 years old are widowed, even in their 20s and 30s. What would you associate? Let's rattle off at least 7 or 8. Something you would associate with widowhood. That is almost always. I can only think of one time that was an exception that I brought this up, and that was not the first thing mentioned. Loneliness. Do you know why Kathy Lee Gifford, you know, NBC TV? Do you know why she moved from New York to Franklin, Tennessee? You can read in the AARP article that was written based on an interview with her. Or you can find a video on YouTube where she was interviewed about that. After her husband, Frank Gifford, died, she left New York and moved to Franklin, Tennessee because she was painfully lonely. Painfully lonely. That was interesting that she used that word linked with lonely. I talked to a man in his early 80s when I was in West Tennessee and working with a church in Murray City, Tennessee, which was about 80 miles northeast of Graceland. For those of you who are younger, Memphis. About 80 miles northeast of Memphis. And we had this ongoing widowhood ministry, and I had heard about him losing his wife, and I called him on the phone. Now, number one, this is a male, and number two, he's in his early 80s. I've never met him before personally. His last name was Burchard. And in the course of the conversation and me inviting him to the widowhood ministry we had there in our fellowships that we had monthly, he described himself as painfully lonely. Here's a man opening up to another man and talking about his loneliness in the same way Kathy Lee Gifford talked about hers. Painfully lonely. It is a unique form of loneliness. Yeah, loneliness commonly associated with widowhood. Give me something else commonly associated with widowhood. A word or a phrase that would describe something about widowhood. Devastating. That's a good word. Accurate word. It's a devastating thing. How about another word? Another phrase. Ostracized. Ostracized. If you're such a small percentage of the world's population and you're living in a coupled world, you know what you are when you're widowed? This is a hard concept, but it's a reality. You're a misfit. That's what you are. Because the world's a coupled world, and you're a misfit. Not by your choice. Just like a person who's lost a limb by amputation. They're different. You know, it's not something that we would desire to experience, but we're different. Just like a cancer patient. A cancer patient is not healthy. We think about people, the vast majority of people being healthy in varying positive degrees. But when you're a cancer patient, you're different. So, if you live in a coupled world and you're not a part of a couple anymore, see that struggle that you have? Especially with social interaction. This third book that I'm going to write about, it's going to be called After the End Comes. The first one I wrote is When the End Comes. The second one was Before the End Comes. Both of them are back on that table in the back of the auditorium here. The third one's going to be After the End Comes. One of the really difficult things about after the end of your marriage is your place. Your place in social settings. Your place in the church. It's just very difficult. Can you think of any other word or phrase you would associate with widowhood? Change. It's not a chosen change. Again, like last night, if you were here, it's a forced change. You've got to deal, it's not something that you wanted, not something you chose. It was something you were forced to deal with. What is this? It's a present. It's a box. It's a gift. It's a gift. Okay, now, Has anybody here ever been given a gift they didn't want? I'll bet some of you have a wedding gift that has been tucked away in a basement or in a closet that you haven't seen for decades. That's not an uncommon thing. What do you do with a gift you've not desired, you didn't want? What do you do with a gift that you didn't want? What do you do? Oh, re-gift. Now, you men need to listen real carefully. Women know about this stuff, okay? You can re-gift it, okay? You can re-gift it. Like I suggested, how about if you put it in a closet somewhere and you just store it? Then you just forget about it. Out of sight, what is it? It's out of mind. Out of sight, out of mind. And then when you move, after you've been there 20, 25 years, and you decide to move, you find I forgot that I was given that. And it's even in the original package. What else could you do with a gift that you were given that you didn't want? Now think creatively here. If you have an entrepreneurial spirit, what might you do? Oh yes, what about selling it? Put it on eBay. Facebook Marketplace. Hey, that'd be good stewardship, right? Okay. Now, loss is something that life gives us. We're all going to experience loss. It's inevitable. You can't live in a fallen, broken world without experiencing loss. It's just a matter of time, and it's a matter of number. You're going to experience it. When is it going to happen, and how often is it going to happen? Now, what are you going to do with this gift that you don't want? Do you want to give the loss to somebody else? Nobody would do that. You wouldn't want somebody to deal with that heartbreak and that loneliness and that feeling of being a fifth wheel, being a misfit. You wouldn't want somebody to deal with that. You can't sell it either. How about if you decided to just store your loss in a closet and put it somewhere? Can you forget it? Ain't no way. You can't put it somewhere and then forget about it. Because what's going to happen is you're going to have to live with that. The reality is, everywhere you go, every day of your life and every night of your life, you're going to have to live with that. What needs to happen eventually in the grief journey afterwards is a healthy thing to do, I think, is absorb the loss. Absorb it and let it become a part of you. My wife's death, her Parkinson's disease, and that very difficult caregiving experience that I'll talk about tomorrow morning, Lord willing, I've absorbed that into my life. It's become a part of me. The rest of my life, I can't get rid of that. I can't forget about it. But I've chosen to absorb that into my life as a part of me. And as a matter of fact, what I've chosen to do is absorb that into my life and use it for God's glory, for His benefit, by compassionately, with an understanding heart, trying to help other people. Life sometimes gives you gifts you don't want. So what we have to do is decide, as Christians, as God's people, what am I going to do with what life's given me that I don't want? It could be cancer. It could be the betrayal of a friend. It could be divorce. There's all kinds of things that life could give you that you don't want. You have to decide what to do with them. Yes, ma'am. Your sister took you to the beach, okay? Okay. How soon after, do you recall? 3 months after or so? Okay.
They're just good fishing buddies.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Again, that can sometimes be After loss, there are things that impact you, and you can actually find gains in loss, like that change of perspective. Something as brutal as loss can compel you to look at things differently. I can frankly say I look at God differently now than I did when I was married. And I mean that in all positive ways. I look at other people differently. I definitely look at marriage differently. I look at loss differently. There are things that sometimes you experience, these losses, they're going to have an effect on you. But the great thing about the loss is we get to decide how it affects us and what we do with it. We don't have a choice about whether or not we're going to experience forced loss, but we do have a choice about what it's going to do to us and how we can use it in our life. Let me run through a number of different things that might give you a different perspective. Grief and relief. Obviously, grief is what we experience after we lose something of value. Remember from last night, we value things inside of us. Where our treasure is, there will our heart be also. When we lose something of great value, we're going to experience grief. We're going to agonize because we've lost something of value. We also need to remember that there are times when the loss, even of a spouse, can be as much relief as it is grief. Think about the spouse who loses a spouse who was the instigator of domestic violence, or maybe was a druggie of some sort, maybe an alcoholic. Not all marriages are good. There are a lot of miserable marriages, sadly. And sometimes the death of a spouse, it'll be grief, but sometimes there is as much relief as there is grief. And you can also struggle with that issue, feeling guilty sometimes that you have that relief, when you've been taught that what you ought to experience is grief. I call it confliction. It can be very conflicting internally. Another thing is tears. The vast majority of people spend a lot of time crying. I am a messed up man, and I readily admit that. But I have an excuse. Having had a wife for 41 years and having 3 daughters, I suffer from an affliction I call overexposure to the female gender. I'm just not normal, okay? I'm a guy who I like Hallmark movies. Now, after my wife passed away, I had to beg off of those for 2 or 3 years because I couldn't. As a matter of fact, when it came to music, the vast majority, I would not listen to the radio or any music because a lot of the music is romantic type music, and I just couldn't handle that. But, I am more of an emotional man than the typical man. And I cried a boatload of tears. When we start tearing up in the presence of somebody else, or start crying in the presence of somebody else, what is the classic thing we always say? I'm sorry. Okay, I'm sorry. What do we have to be sorry about? You have a right to grieve, and you have a right to every tear, anytime, anywhere, in the presence of anyone. God gave you the ability to cry for a reason. Trying to stop yourself from doing that is like feeling bad because you feel bad. It's not healthy. You go ahead and cry anytime you want to. I've shed tears in the pulpit. I've shed tears in the presence of other people in their homes, in nursing homes, at hospitals. God gave us the ability to cry for a reason. There are also some people who physiologically, they can't cry. And that's okay too. And they may struggle with that issue, that they see other people who are crying and shedding tears, and yet they have a hard time doing that because of their physical makeup. But again, that's a part of widowhood. Heartache like you've never seen before because you've never experienced losses like this particular loss. You've got questions that you start asking and thinking about that you'd never thought about before. And those questions can be about people, about the church, about yourself, about God. I know a retired preacher that I love dearly, who for every day for over a year, there were members of the church who came and helped him with his afflicted wife. And she died. And since her death, not one person has come to his house to visit with him. When he told me that, I reminded him about the fact that, people don't understand. They were great, compassionate supporters of his in the gradual loss of his wife. But they didn't know how much he needed them after the loss. He's not bitter about it. He was just reporting to me the way that it was. There are questions sometimes that get raised about people, about friendships, about the church. And then there can be a faith struggle. There's no embarrassment that ought to be associated with admitting the fact that you're dealing with a faith crisis. Remember that guy in Mark 9 who brought his son to Jesus who was severely afflicted? And he cried out to the Lord, "Lord, I believe." And then what did he say? "Help my unbelief." Why was he struggling with his faith? What was going on in his life that would cause him to say something like that sounds so conflicting? What was he dealing with? Luke says his only child, and that child was afflicted by a demon. He saw with his own eyes and heard with his own ears what this child of his was going through since birth. He had struggled with this thing for years. He was in agony. He was dealing with a faith crisis. You know what is the great thing about a faith crisis? That faith crisis is a great spiritual gymnasium in which you can exercise your faith and grow stronger. Yes, in a faith crisis, you can lose your faith. But that's a choice. It's not a necessity. If we keep working on it, and we'll talk a little bit more about this tomorrow morning, about the need for patience and waiting on the Lord during our really difficult times in life. What we've got to realize is that we're human, and God knows that we're human. And He understands at times when we struggle with our faith, because things are not always like we thought that they should be. And then when you think about the loneliness that we've already referenced, and there's the identity crisis. If you were half of a whole, and the whole no longer exists, what are you? You've got to reinvent yourself and reestablish an identity. You used to be somebody's husband, somebody's wife, but you're not anymore. But you feel that way in your heart, inside, in your feeler, you feel that way. But in God's sight and legally, you're not that person's husband or wife anymore. So you have this identity crisis. There can be financial jeopardy that are experienced. You're dealing with forced change. You're having to deal now with the absence of that person. That person is no longer somebody you can see with your eyes and that you can touch or that you can smell. And that absence is a very harsh thing to deal with. You know what I miss most? I miss most touch. Oh, for the blessing to be able to hold that hand one more time, or to hug that body one more time, or to kiss that body one more time. Again, that is why I mentioned that my number one target audience in these widowhood workshops is married people. I hope that those of you who are married will cherish the blessing of being able to see that person, hear that person, smell that person, touch that person. Because every day and every chance you have to do that is such a tremendous blessing that we need to appreciate before the loss. Because I guarantee you, after the loss, you'll appreciate it. But you'll be hurt by it too. There's dreams. It's not uncommon. As a matter of fact, it wasn't more than a couple of weeks ago, I had a dream that involved my wife. I've talked to people who've lost their spouses and had dreams about their spouses 15, 20 years after their spouse had died. The vast majority of times, those widowed people tell me that they kind of look at that as kind of like a visit, and they hate to wake up. The vast majority of those dreams are just a wonderful, kind of like reunion sort of a thing. And it's just a real blessing to a lot of people. You've got to deal with the silence. You can't get much more silent than when you're living all by yourself in a house. And there's the emptiness that you feel in your life because of that void. The person's no longer there. And you have a dependence that you have to recognize because you're a mess. You've gone through a huge loss. It may be the hardest loss that you'll ever experience in your life. People who have done these studies about life stressors, when they do these studies, two things often, always, everyone that I've ever seen, the number one life stressor is the loss of a spouse by death. The second one is divorce. You have to deal with the reality that now things are different, and you may need to be depending on people like you've never depended on them before. One of the books back there on the display table, which is out there to help you see some of the different things that have been written that might help you with different life crises and struggles. One of the books back there mentions the fact that when you lose your spouse, it's good to develop a life board of trustees. My life board of trustees was my 3 daughters and my 2 sons-in-law. They became my board of directors, and so I would bounce things off of them, especially big decisions and things I was trying to navigate. I wanted response from them. You know, you need somebody on your board of directors who can be somebody you can trust with some spiritual advice and direction. You need somebody to help you with your financial matters. You need somebody maybe to help you with the house and some of the issues you may have with the house. There are all kinds of areas where in our life we might need to depend on some other people for some feedback, and the stress level is unbelievable because we've never been through that. And there's not the uncommon response. There's the anger. Jackie told me after she lost her husband that sometimes in the shower, she would beat the side of the wall on the shower and shout, "Why did you leave me?" It wasn't his choice. But you see, she was speaking out of her feeler. She felt deserted, and that anger, she had anger toward him. It's not an uncommon thing for people to be angry with the medical profession that they feel like has failed them, or anger toward God. You know what the best thing to do when we're angry toward God is spend some time with him. Sometimes we just need to spend more time with the Father who loves us that we don't understand. That's permitted some awful things to happen in our life, yet loves us and cares for us and can help us better than anybody else in our lives. God knows when we're angry, and God hears everything that we say to him. And you know, the best thing to do when we have people who are angry with us in our life is for us to be together. Talk it out. Feel it out. Interact with one another and work through that. It's not an embarrassment. It's not something that we should be ashamed to admit that we have anger toward God, because you know what? There may be people on our life board of directors who can help us with that. And we might start worrying about things we'd never worried about before and have fears about our future, about what's going to be in front of us, and a restlessness, a tossing and turning, especially at night. The 2 hardest places I've decided from all the widowed people that I know, and I know, I'm sure, way more than the common person. The 2 hardest places for a widowed person to go are, number 1, to bed. Because what does that remind them of? They are alone. They're alone. I know of people, both males and females, who after loss never went back to the bedroom for months. They slept on the couch. That was the way they handled that. And that's great. That was their effective way of dealing with that. There can be so much restlessness, especially trying to get some sleep and going back to bed. The second very difficult place for a widowed person to go is right here, to church. A place that we generally perceive of as loving, comforting, and encouraging. I can't tell you the number of widowed people who have talked to me about how stressful that was and their restlessness that they experienced when they tried to come back to church. If you've done that with somebody else, especially for years, and now you're forced to deal with coming to that same experience without them, it's hard. Do you sit in the same place? If you sit in the same place, what are you going to think about? Who's not there? You know, one of the things that I don't like about public worship now for me is I can't hold the hand of my wife when we pray together in the public assembly. I miss that. I remember being in Florida with a friend of mine. She's in her early 60s. She lost her husband in her late 50s. And we were sitting together in this corporate worship situation. And whenever we began to pray together in that public assembly, we held hands together. She enjoyed that, and I did too. There's just a restlessness. It can be very, very difficult for people to come back to church after they've lost a loved one. We need to recognize that. It can be an intimidating place for a widowed person to go. In Chester, West Virginia, when I did the first Widowhood workshop, there was an older gentleman in his early 80s, bald-headed guy, who came to me with a lot of excess water in his eyes. And he said, "Dean, on that list of things commonly associated with widowhood, I have a suggestion," and that was his. Suicidal thoughts. There's a book called Saturday Night Widows. It was written by this lady who, after she lost her husband, went to this widowhood support group and got kicked out of it and decided to start her own. They were living in the New York City area. Now, these are not Christians. It's a book you can find in the library. A lot of public libraries have this book. It's called Saturday Night Widows. In that book, one of the ladies in this different support group that this lady, this excommunicated lady, having decided to start her own widowhood group, this group, among other things, got together and talked very freely with one another. One of the ladies said in one of those Saturday night gatherings, "Ever since this happened," she's talking about her loss, "ever since this happened, I feel like Dorothy in The Wizard of Oz. Like a tornado has picked up my house, is spinning it around, and I just want to know where it's going to land." Sister Stapleton, who works at a preacher school in Texas, she'd been married for 47 years to her husband, who was a preacher and a missionary. And she said, "I know I have to do the best each day, but it is hard at times. I never dreamed it would be this difficult." A Christian sister, 2 years and 3 months after she had experienced her loss. Let me share with you a couple of different things that people have shared with me. Another sister in the Lord, she said, "Never anyone here anymore when I come home. Never been so lonely in my life. Staying busy does not help you escape coming home to an empty house. My kids do not talk about their daddy either. I have tried to explain to them how it hurts me, for I know how much they loved him. But we cry, and they don't like to see their mama cry. So they won't talk about their daddy, which is what she wants her children to do." See the issue? The family ignorance about grief is making her grief experience more difficult. Let me share with you out of a book written by Phyllis Green. Just as a recovering alcoholic is never free from the desire for a drink, I too am a recovering griever, never free from my desire for the life that I had. There just aren't 12 steps to help me. A sister in the Lord in Arkansas, her name is Jackie, shared with me, I wasn't a person anymore. Couples turned their backs on me. I reconnected with a Christian sister recently who lost her husband by divorce. And she was told by her best friend, she was told that she couldn't invite her over to her house because if she did with couples, that would make an uneven number, an odd number. Her best friend told her that. I met Kathy in Titusville, Florida, and this was a text that she sent to me on April 14th of 2020. I was told by a family member that loves me that time will heal. I don't think it is at all possible. 33 years of my life with my husband, sharing 3 children together, was my whole world. I can't see past today, and the pain is too much. H. Norman Wright is a counselor type fellow who he lost his wife, and after he lost his wife, he wrote about that, and he, I understand, has since passed. Let me read to you a section out of his book called Reflections of a Grieving Spouse. The loss of our spouses changes our entire lives. It shifts the foundation of our existence. Nothing is as it was. Even the familiar becomes unfamiliar. Every aspect of our lives is disrupted without our partners. Everything has to be relearned, just as a flooded river does when it recedes and leaves behind a maze of new streams. In a culture that doesn't like to acknowledge loss or talk about its impact, grieving is difficult. And when we add to this silence the fact that most of us have never been taught about the process and normalcy of grief, no wonder we struggle. Prior to the death of your spouse, your life was going in a well-established direction. You had an identity. You could say who you were. This has changed. You're not exactly who you were. The person you lost was a part of your identity. You were someone's spouse, someone's partner. You continue to be that person in your heart and memory, but there's a vacant space where that loved one stood. Out there on the table, there's also a book called The Widow's Mite. And in that book, she writes this way: if I could have one positive thing come from Dale's death, it would be the ability to explain in words the utter, overwhelming sadness of the loss. One of the primary differences between the death of your spouse and the loss of anyone else is that you have a level of physical intimacy with your spouse you just don't have with other people. That, combined with the sheer amount of time that you spend together, heightens the loss. Until you live it, she said, I'm not sure you can totally wrap your thoughts around the crushing magnitude of losing a beloved spouse. Even as a strong woman with a powerful faith walk, a wonderful family, and a large support group, I was brought to my knees by Dale's death. I have totally changed how I think about life, marriage, and myself. Whatever happens in my future, I will never be the same. I didn't know about life after loss. Oh, I knew about loss because I was with those people. But what I was clueless about was the life afterwards. Now you found out a little bit more about what it's like. Some of those things were shared with me by godly Christian people who'd been Christians for years. And they have struggled with what it's like. Why is widowhood such a difficult experience? When you stop and think about marriage, it's the only human relationship described in the Bible with that unique phrase, those 2 words, one flesh. There are 8.7 billion people on the face of this earth. Now, my little brain has a hard time comprehending big stuff. 8.7 billion people in this world. How many people are in your marriage? 2. There's only one other person out of 8.7 billion people on the face of the earth in that marriage. That relationship is really special, the most unique of all human relationships. If you want a magnificent marriage, here is the recipe: total giving of the total self for a total lifetime. There are no perfect marriages because the only people in marriage are imperfect. There's no other kind of human being than imperfect. If we're going to have a magnificent marriage, not a perfect one, but a magnificent marriage that glorifies God and is a blessing to us, two people have to be committed to this philosophy: total giving, total self, total lifetime. If you have a human relationship like that, and you have poured yourself into that relationship, and that other person has poured themselves into that relationship, and now that relationship no longer exists, there's no wonder you're a mess. Think about how unique that widowhood is. We're individuals. God doesn't use the same cookie cutter. We're different. We're individuals. You know, you stop and think about relationships. Our relationships with our spouses and with other people, they're all different. These are things that are going to affect your life after loss. Some families are very open and very transparent. Some families are very dysfunctional. Some families are private to a fault. Then you've got the timeline thing. I know of people, well, let me tell you about Susie. Susie knew this guy for 31 years. 29 of those 31 years, she was married to this guy who was a preacher. He up and died on her. He got sick. He died of cancer. She was in her 40s. She lost her husband. About a year and a half later, Susie married again at 49 years old. She married a second time. 5 months after she said, "I do," he died. There is a couple at the Villa Rica Church of Christ in Villa Rica, Georgia, where I attend, who've been married for 73 years. He's in his early 90s, and she is about 90. It's going to be a lot of difference losing a second husband after 5 months and losing somebody after 73 years. That's going to affect the widowhood and the experience of life after loss. You think about all the experiences that you had with those individuals in your past, and specifically, especially with that spouse. The loss of those experiences and those memories about those experiences. We sing that song about precious memories. You know what happens with precious memories at loss? They become priceless. They morph from precious to priceless. And sometimes you feel like that's all you have. Some people have no faith. Some people have a weak faith. Some people have a very strong faith. The degree, the presence and the degree of faith is going to affect the life after loss. There's going to be a lot of things that are going to affect the person in their journey after their loss. Brian, could I use you and Elisha really quickly to come up here and do me a favor? A fork in the road. After your loss, what's going to happen in your journey is you're going to experience on that journey at some point in time a fork in the road. Now, if I had put a typical fork in the road up there, you maybe wouldn't remember it, but maybe with this one you will. I want to have every person who has ever experienced the loss of a spouse to get one of these forks. Let them know as they make their way back toward the back of the room, if you have lost a spouse, even if you're remarried, if you've experienced the loss of your spouse, I'd like to have you get one of these forks. Now, these forks, you can have one of two purposes. If you want to lose weight, you can use this fork because you probably are going to eat less, okay? But that's not the reason that I'm giving you this fork. After your loss, you are going to eventually, at some point in time, and I don't know when that is, you're going to come to a fork in the road. Let this fork remind you of decisions, personal decisions. When you pick up a fork, you know, a bigger one, the one we typically eat with, when you pick up a fork, what have you decided to do? You've decided to eat. Okay, now, what other decisions are you making as you sit there? Yesterday, Mac and his wife took me to the cafeteria where I saw this huge row of food. Now, if it had been a covered dish thing like at church, I'd feel compelled to not insult the women by taking a sample of every single thing, okay? But I didn't do that at the cafeteria. I just took about 3 things. But what do we decide to do when we pick up the fork? We decide to eat. Now, what other decisions are we making? What to eat, okay? We're deciding what to eat. What else are we deciding? How much? Oh, this is getting personal now. Okay, now we're deciding how much to eat. We're deciding when, if ever, we lay the fork down, right? Let this fork represent decisions. Lay this fork somewhere and let it remind you, it might be next to the special chair you have, or I know of some who put it on their kitchen counter. Some have put it on their nightstand. Let this remind you about the need to make decisions. After our loss, and after we've deeply grieved, and we need to deeply grieve in whatever is the effective way for us, and we need to do that as long as we need to do it. And nobody has the right to take your grief away. Doug Manning has written a very good book. It's one of the first books I read about this subject back years ago. Don't Take My Grief Away is the title of the book. And he talks about how that with loss, you have earned the right to grieve, and nobody has the right to take that away from you. You grieve in whatever way you need to, as long as you need to. Those are your decisions. But at some point in time, after deeply grieving, you've got to start making some decisions in your life. What am I going to do? Let me tell you what I did. I prayed passionately, like I'd never prayed before, for 3 things. I prayed that the Lord would open for me a door of opportunity to continue to be a minister somewhere. I lost my wife and I'd already resigned from the pulpit at a church so I could take care of my wife. So I was jobless. I asked him to open a door of opportunity for me to continue to be a minister. Number 2, I asked him to give me the vision to see the open door when he opened one for me. You know, sometimes God opens doors, but we don't see. We're so busy with the minutiae of life that we don't see the opportunities that God provides for us. So I asked for him to open a door of opportunity. I asked him to give me the vision to see the open door. And thirdly, and maybe most difficult, I asked him for the courage to walk through the open door into a place I'd never been before. Life after loss, and trying to be a servant of the Lord, a minister after loss. God did open that door. He did give me the vision to see the open door. It took about 1.5 years for that to happen. And I did get the guts to walk through the open door. I ended up in Murray City, Tennessee. We started a local widowhood ministry there. We started with myself and about 4 widowed ladies. And that local ministry grew from that little group to over 20, over 30, almost always over 40 and sometimes over 50 people who came monthly. And we provided them a very unique ministry of encouragement. Typically, half of the people who came for those fellowships were not members of the Lord's church. They were members of other churches. But they were coming to us because we were doing something for them that even their own church was not doing. I had reported to me how that some people went to their denominational churches and bragged about the Murray City, Tennessee church in their community and how they were ministering to the widowed people. we had in 4.5 years, 3 baptisms occurred as a result of that ministry. And one of the things we tried to do was encourage the people. That's what the local widowhood ministries can do. They can encourage people because everybody needs encouragement, but widowed people especially need encouragement because their life is different and their life is very uniquely difficult. Helen Keller, and those of you, I'm sure most of you know her story. She lived a very difficult life. Love this quote, "When one door of happiness closes, another opens. But often we look so long at the closed door that we don't see the one that's been opened for us." Sometimes we're so burdened and so busy that we just don't see the opportunities, the potential. What am I going to do? Well, that's a good question. One thing's for sure, you're not married anymore. Now, you may not like that, you didn't choose it. And you may not feel like that. But God's perspective, which is reality, you're released and you're free. What are you going to do now? Well, when you're single, it's different. It's very different. You know, for years, I met that girl at 15 at church. And to be honest with you, that's when I started going to church for the first time in my life, when I was 15. And I'll admit to you that I was far more interested in that teenage girl than I was the Lord at that point. It took me a long time to develop that concern and care for the Lord. But I began to invest in that relationship, and we eventually ended up getting married at 19 years old. But from the beginning of the time I met her, all the way through the 41 years we were married, we both contributed heavily into that relationship. We had responsibilities that go with healthy human relationships that honor God. But when you're not married, you're described in a different way in 1 Corinthians chapter 7, without care. Not literally, totally without all care, but without the care that comes with the relationship with the Lord. You can more focused care for the things of the Lord. You're, in a sense, you're less distracted. As a matter of fact, there is one book out there on the counter that's titled The Undistracted Widow. So one of the things that I did when I was passionately praying after my wife passed away was I prayed that the Lord would help me to pour all of the time and effort that I'd poured into that human relationship with her, to take all of that and add it to all the effort I'd already been making in my relationship with Him, and add that time and effort and energy into that relationship with Him. Because I knew that was what was going to be helping me best and most. Like we talked about last night, what you need most in your life is the Lord. You may feel like you have a lot of other needs, but who's going to provide for you the things that you need? God's the giver of every good and perfect gift, James 1:27. Whenever we're suffering the grief that goes with loss, we need to understand that we need to pour ourselves into that relationship with God. When we've lost our spouse, we're more available than we've ever been before. We're more flexible than we've ever been before. We have more experience than we've ever had before. So what should I do with my availability, my flexibility, and the experience that I have? You know, sometimes the best people to help other people are people who've experienced what other people have experienced. Now, I don't claim to suggest that you can't effectively minister to the widowed without being widowed, because that's not true. I could have been a better minister and a better brother in the Lord if I had learned about widowhood prior to the loss of my wife. You know, if you read about widowhood and you read about grief and you do some personal research and you interact with close relationships and transparently with other widowed people who will honestly share with you what it's like to be widowed, you can learn a lot about widowhood and minister to widowed people effectively. After I was in Alamosa, Colorado, and did a widowhood workshop there, there was a young couple there, a young married couple there, who decided after that workshop they were going to be the ones to start that local ongoing widowhood ministry there. Married couples can be blessed by working with those who are widowed because it will deepen and your appreciation for your marriage. And you'll learn a lot about one of the two of you are going to experience after loss. But why not use all that we have to try to be a blessing to others? What you want to get to eventually after loss is you want to get to some sort of a new normal, a new beginning. Again, though, remember last night, there's that neutral zone period where you have to have low expectations. I'm the kind of person where my philosophy is shoot for the sun, moon, and stars, then settle for what you have to. But shoot for the sun, moon, and stars. There are some unique times in life, though, that it's better to shoot low. After loss, it's good to shoot low. You know what you need to do after you've lost your spouse or some other very, very close person in your life? What you need to do is breathe. And that's all. Just survive. Don't even let yourself think about coping. That's way down the road in the grief journey. All you've got to do is survive. You've got to keep breathing. If you put together a bunch of keep breathing times, what's going to happen is you're going to start learning coping skills, especially if you devote yourself to learning a little bit more about grief and then internalizing your loss. What's going to happen is you're going to learn coping skills. I write about these three things: surviving and coping, and then the third thing, surviving, coping, and growing. I wrote about those in the addendum in the first book I wrote, When the End Comes. What's going to happen is you're going to grow through this experience. If you choose to grow, again, it's a matter of choice. What you need to decide is, okay, what do you want for a new normal? And then you work toward that. And it takes time. And you have to make a lot of decisions along the way. Very, very challenging. And it's going to take time. And you've got to be patient with yourself. You know, we preach so often about God being patient, God being long-suffering. And He is, isn't He? Now, shouldn't we be that way? As imitators of Him, shouldn't we be that way? And we need to be patient toward others, right? How about being patient with yourself? Cut yourself some slack. Realize that you're a human being. You're going to struggle because of that fact. Whatever your future is going to be, one thing's for sure, it's going to be what you make it. And it's really hard to make a new future, to create a new identity. It's extremely difficult. The end of the second session for this morning. It is now 11:09, and I'm almost penitent. But I said almost. The reality is we only have a brief amount of time left. Let's take a break for 5 minutes, and I will share with you this third session that is really, I think, critically important. I'm not going to be able to do justice to it because of the time, but it is so important that we understand about marriage, especially after loss. And we need to think about this because you can't talk about marriage after loss without talking about marriage. I've often said to people when I've done these widowhood workshops, if you have teenagers or young adults who've never been married, this is the session they need to come to. Because there are things that we're going to talk about in this session that are very important to think about and do your homework in before any marriage, even the first one. But we want to spend a little bit of time talking about that, and I'll do it in as concise and swift a fashion as possible. But I'll leave with some regret because I know I can't do it like I'd like to because of the time. But let's take a break.